She yanked my crutch out of my hand like she was ripping away my dignity, and my own parents laughed as I hit the floor. So, tell me, how did a moment that cruel become the reason my sister lost everything when the will was read? My name is Danielle Foster. I'm 35 years old, and for the last 10 years, I've built a life most people would call successful. I'm a financial consultant. I work with clients who trust me with their savings, their futures, and the kind of decisions that keep people awake at night. I own my own place. I drive a reliable car. I pay my bills on time. I don't ask anyone for help, and I don't owe anyone anything. At least, that's what I believed. Because when it comes to family, you can be independent on paper and still be trapped in a role you never chose. You can be the one who gives and somehow still be labeled the selfish one. You can spend your whole life trying to earn love from people who only see you when they need something. And in my family, I was the one they never really saw. Not because I was quiet, not because I lacked personality, but because my sister, Claire, had always been the sun in their universe. Everyone else orbited around her. Everyone else adjusted their lives around her moods. And if she wanted something attention, sympathy, control, she didn't ask for it. She took it. I didn't always understand that. For a long time, I convinced myself she was just difficult, that my parents were just tired, that family dynamics were messy, and I should be the bigger person. I swallowed things I shouldn't have swallowed. I forgave things that didn't deserve forgiveness. I kept my mouth shut to keep the peace. Looking back now, I realized something painful. I wasn't keeping the peace. I was teaching them that I could be treated however they wanted, and I'd still show up. But none of that hit me as hard as the night my sister grabbed my crutch. It happened at my grandfather's house, during one of those Sunday dinners that are supposed to feel warm and safe, the kind where the smell of roasted chicken fills the kitchen and everyone talks over each other, and you're meant to feel like you belong. Except I never really belonged. Not in the way Claire did. That night, I arrived late because I'd just come from the doctor. 2 weeks earlier, I'd injured my knee outside a grocery store. An elderly woman had fallen near the entrance hard. People walked past her like she was invisible. I didn't. I ran over, tried to help her up, and when she slipped again, my knee twisted under the weight. The pain was immediate and sharp, but I stayed with her until someone finally called for help. Later, the doctor told me it was a serious injury. He gave me a crutch and strict instructions: stay off my feet as much as possible, or it would take months to heal properly. So when I walked into my grandfather's house that Sunday, limping slightly and leaning on my crutch, I expected, I don't know, a little concern, a simple, "Are you okay?" I should have known better. The moment Claire saw the crutch, her eyes lit up, not with empathy, with excitement, like she'd been handed a new toy. She didn't say anything right away. She waited. Claire always waited. She liked timing. She liked an audience. She spent the whole dinner making little comments soft enough to sound like jokes, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Still playing the victim, Danielle?" she said with a smile. My parents laughed. They always laughed. My mother shook her head like I was a child being dramatic. My father smirked into his drink, and I sat there, smiling politely, trying to pretend it didn't sting. Trying to pretend I didn't feel the familiar loneliness spreading across my chest like cold water. Because that was the pattern. Claire made me the punchline. My parents backed her up, and I was expected to take it. My grandfather, Henry, was the only person in that room who didn't laugh. He watched quietly. He didn't interrupt. But his eyes stayed sharp, like he was reading something between the lines. Grandpa Henry was 82, but he still had the kind of presence that made you sit up straighter. He wasn't loud. He wasn't flashy. He was the kind of man who didn't need to prove anything, because his life already had. And he was the only one who ever made me feel real. Like I wasn't just a supporting character in Claire's story. Dinner ended like it always did. Plates were cleared, dessert was served, and everyone settled into that post-meal comfort where people loosen their collars and start talking about money without saying the word money. I remember sitting on the couch, my knee throbbing from being bent too long. I remember Claire watching me in that way she had, like she was measuring something, like she was waiting for a moment. I didn't realize she was building toward it. When it was time to leave, I stood carefully. I held my crutch tight, shifting my weight slowly so I wouldn't strain my knee. My whole body felt tired. Not just physically, emotionally. I just wanted to go home. I took maybe 3 steps. That's when it happened. A hand shot out from behind me. Claire's hand. She grabbed the crutch and yanked it away so hard the metal scraped against my palm. It was so sudden I didn't even understand what was happening until my balance was already gone. "Stop pretending," she said, loud enough for the entire room to hear. Her voice was sharp, almost gleeful. "You're fine. You can walk." I didn't have time to catch myself. My injured knee buckled instantly, and I hit the floor. Hard. The pain was blinding. It exploded through my knee and shot up my spine like electricity. For a second, I couldn't breathe. My cheek pressed against the cold tile, and my hands trembled as I tried to push myself up. And then I heard it. Laughter. Not just Claire. My parents. My mother's voice cut through the fog of pain like a knife. "She always exaggerates," she said, amused. Like I was putting on a show. My father didn't move. He stood by the fireplace with his arms crossed, watching me like I was embarrassing him. Claire stood over me, holding my crutch like a trophy, her lips curled into that familiar sneer. I remember looking around the room, searching faces, still hoping for one person to say, "Claire, stop." No one did. In the corner, my little cousin Emma started to cry. She was only 7 years old, and she had just watched a grown woman attack her aunt while the adults laughed. No one comforted her either. They were too busy enjoying my humiliation. Something inside me broke in that moment. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly. I pulled myself up using the edge of a chair. My knee screamed, but I refused to stay on the floor. I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me defeated. I reached out, took my crutch back from Claire without saying a word, and she let me have it like she'd completed her performance. I limped toward the door. Not a single person asked if I was okay. As I reached the hallway, I heard Claire whisper to my mother. She thought I was out of earshot, but the house was quiet, and her voice carried. "See?" she murmured, smug and certain. "I told you she was faking. Now Grandpa saw it too. He'll know who really deserves to be in this family." I didn't turn around. I kept walking. I made it to my car, shut the door, and the moment I was alone, I started shaking. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly, my knuckles turned white. Tears blurred my vision. I cried for 20 minutes before I could even think about driving. Not just because my knee hurt, because something deeper hurt. Because I finally understood what I'd been refusing to admit for years. My family didn't just misunderstand me. They enjoyed hurting me. And Claire wasn't just cruel. She was strategic. What I didn't know, sitting there in my car, was that Claire's little performance hadn't gone the way she thought it had. Because while she was busy humiliating me, someone else had been watching. Someone who didn't laugh, someone who didn't fall for her act. My grandfather. And he didn't just witness what happened. He recorded it. Claire didn't know that Grandpa had a security camera in his living room. She didn't know it had a sensitive microphone. She didn't know that after I left, feeling broken and alone, she would make the biggest mistake of her life. Because she stayed behind, and she bragged, right there in the same room, on the phone, out loud, about how she'd exposed me, and how the inheritance was basically hers now. And that phone call, those careless words, would become the reason she walked into a lawyer's office 3 weeks later, smiling like she'd already won, only to have the very first line of the will destroy her in front of everyone. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because before we get to the lawyer's office, you need to understand how my sister became the kind of person who could yank a crutch from her own sister's hand, watch her hit the floor, and smile. And why my own parents laughed instead of helping. So let me take you back to the beginning. To the moment I became the invisible daughter, and Claire became the golden one. I used to think what happened with the crutch was the worst thing my sister had ever done to me. But the truth is, that moment only felt so shocking because it was the first time she hurt me in a way that everyone could see. For years, Claire had been hurting me in ways that left no bruises, only stories. Stories that made me look selfish. Stories that made me look dramatic. Stories that made my parents roll their eyes every time I walked into a room. And the scariest part? They believed her. Or maybe they didn't even need to believe her. Maybe they just needed a reason to keep loving her more than me. After I left my grandfather's house that night, I didn't sleep. My knee was swollen, throbbing under an ice pack, but the physical pain wasn't what kept me awake. It was the sound of my mother laughing. It was my father's smirk. It was Claire's whisper in the hallway. Now Grandpa saw it too. Because she wasn't just humiliating me for fun, she was trying to rewrite my reputation in the one place she couldn't fully control. Grandpa Henry. He was the only person in my family who still looked at me like I mattered. And if Claire could poison him against me, she'd have everything. Not just the inheritance. Not just the house. She'd have the final proof that she had won. That was the game she'd been playing for most of my life. I just hadn't realized it was a game until I was already losing. To understand why my sister could do something like that, you have to understand what my family was like long before I ever walked into that living room with a crutch. In my family, love wasn't something you earned by being kind. Love was something you earned by being useful. And I was useful in the wrong ways. Claire was born with the kind of personality that filled every space. She cried loudly, she laughed loudly, she wanted things loudly. And my parents responded to that like it was normal, like it was charming, like it was proof she was special. I was different. I wasn't quieter because I was weaker. I was quieter because I learned early that my feelings didn't change anything. If I cried, I was dramatic. If I complained, I was ungrateful. If I defended myself, I was starting trouble. So I learned to swallow things. I learned to step aside. I learned to be the daughter who didn't need anything. And the moment you become that daughter, you become invisible. When I was 18, my parents sat me down at the kitchen table like they were doing me a favor. My mother kept her voice soft, like she was delivering bad news to someone who couldn't handle it. "Claire needs more space," she said. That was the reason. Not that we couldn't afford the house. Not that we were moving. Not that something tragic happened. Just, Claire wanted my room. She was 16, and she wanted the bigger bedroom, the one with the better window, the one I'd lived in for years. And my parents decided I was the one who should sacrifice. They gave me 2 weeks to move out. 2 weeks. I remember staring at them, waiting for the punchline, waiting for someone to say, "We're kidding." No one did. My father didn't even look guilty. He just said, "You're 18. You're an adult now." Like adulthood was a punishment for not being Claire. So I did what I always did. I adapted. I found a tiny apartment with thin walls and a kitchen the size of a closet. I worked 2 jobs through college. I took extra shifts, skipped vacations, learned to stretch groceries into meals that lasted all week. I paid my own tuition. I built my own life with my own hands. I should have been proud, and I was. But pride doesn't protect you when the people who raised you decide to rewrite the story. Because in my family's version of history, I didn't get pushed out. I left. I abandoned them. I was the selfish daughter who ran away to chase money and freedom while they struggled without me. That story was convenient. It made them the victims. It made Claire the fragile one who needed support. And it made me the villain. Claire watched that narrative take shape and learned a lesson that would define her entire personality. Truth doesn't matter. Only repetition matters. So she repeated it. Every holiday, every phone call, every time my name came up. Danielle never comes around. Danielle only cares about herself. Danielle thinks she's better than us. And my parents nodded along because it was easier than admitting what they'd done. It was easier than admitting they had chosen one daughter over the other. Meanwhile, I grew up. I graduated. I worked my way into a career that demanded discipline and precision. I became a financial consultant because I liked numbers, because numbers don't lie, and I was tired of living in a world where everything could be twisted into a story. I built stability. I built independence. And I told myself I didn't need my family's approval. But here's the part that still makes my throat tighten when I think about it. Even after everything, I still tried to help them. Because some part of me never stopped hoping that if I was generous enough, if I was patient enough, if I was good enough, they would eventually look at me and realize I had always loved them. So when my parents called asking for help, I helped. When their roof leaked, I wrote a check. When my mother's medical bills started stacking up, I quietly paid them. When Claire maxed out her credit cards and was on the verge of bankruptcy, I covered the payments through Grandpa so she wouldn't be embarrassed. I didn't do it because Claire deserved it. I did it because I didn't want my grandfather to watch his family fall apart, and because, deep down, I was still that 18-year-old girl who thought love could be earned. The money always disappeared, but the gratitude never arrived. My parents didn't say thank you. They didn't acknowledge my help. They didn't even seem to understand it came from me. They believed it came from Grandpa, and I let them believe that. Because if they knew it was me, they'd either demand more, or they'd twist it into another story about how I was trying to control them. So I stayed quiet. Again, I told myself it was peace, but it wasn't peace. It was fear. Fear that if I spoke up, they'd hate me even more. Fear that if I demanded respect, I'd lose the little connection I still had. And Claire loved that, because as long as I stayed silent, she stayed golden. As long as I stayed invisible, she stayed bright. That's why, when Grandpa's health started to decline, Claire suddenly became devoted. She started visiting him alone. Weekly visits. Sometimes twice a week. At first, I tried to believe she'd changed. I wanted to believe it. I wanted to believe my sister was capable of love that wasn't selfish. But the more I watched, the more something felt wrong. Claire didn't visit Grandpa like someone who missed him. She visited like someone inspecting an investment. She brought cookies and smiled and sat by his chair, but her eyes were always calculating, always measuring, always watching how he responded when she mentioned money, property, family legacy. She'd laugh and say things like, "I just want to make sure everything is taken care of, Grandpa, so the family doesn't fight," as if she wasn't the one sharpening the knives. And then she started doing something else. Something I didn't realize at the time. She started planting seeds. Not obvious lies. Claire was smarter than that. She told the truth in ways that made it sound ugly. "Danielle's always busy," she'd say. "She never has time for us." "She's doing so well now," she'd sigh. "Sometimes I wonder if she even needs family anymore." Danielle only calls when something's wrong. And the worst part? Some of those statements were technically true. I was busy. I didn't come around often. I didn't call just to chat, but not because I didn't care. Because every time I came around, I left feeling smaller. Because every time I called, Claire made it into a performance. Because my family didn't feel like home. It felt like a courtroom where I was always on trial. Claire knew that. She used it. And she was counting on Grandpa being old enough, tired enough, lonely enough to believe her. What she didn't know was that Grandpa Henry had spent 82 years learning how to read people. He had been underestimated his whole life. He had survived manipulation. He had watched families tear each other apart over money. And he had a way of listening that made you feel like you couldn't hide from him, not really. I didn't know what Claire was saying during those visits. I didn't know she was slowly poisoning him against me. But I did know something had shifted. Because one evening, after dinner, Grandpa pulled me aside when no one was watching. His hand was warm on my arm, steady. And he said quietly, "You're like me when I was young." Then he looked straight into my eyes and added something I didn't understand until it was too late. "But you won't have to wait until the end of your life to be seen." At the time, I thought he was comforting me. I didn't realize he was warning me. Because Claire wasn't just trying to humiliate me. She was trying to erase me. And she believed she was close. That's why she grabbed my crutch that night. That's why she wanted Grandpa to see me on the floor. Because she thought if she could make me look like a liar, then she could finally take everything. And she was so sure she'd won, that after I left, she did the one thing manipulators always do when they think they're untouchable. She got careless. She bragged. And she didn't realize the person she was trying to deceive had already been watching her the entire time. Because Grandpa Henry wasn't fooled. Not even for a second. And what he did next would change all of our lives forever. Looking back now, I realized something that still makes my stomach twist. Claire didn't become cruel overnight. She became cruel, the way mold grows in a house no one wants to inspect quietly, steadily, fed by neglect, protected by silence. And in our family, silence was the strongest currency. After that Sunday dinner, after I limped out of Grandpa's house with my knee screaming and my dignity in pieces, I kept replaying Claire's whisper in the hallway. Now Grandpa saw it too. He'll know who really deserves to be in this family. It wasn't just a nasty comment. It was a mission statement. Claire wasn't trying to hurt me because she hated me. She was trying to erase me because she was terrified of what would happen if anyone truly saw me. If anyone looked at me and recognized my value, Claire's entire identity would collapse. Because Claire's identity was built on being the chosen one, the golden child, the daughter who could do no wrong, and when you grow up being treated like you're the center of the universe, you start believing other people exist to orbit you. My parents had trained her to think that way. They didn't do it with one dramatic decision. They did it through 1,000 small ones, through the way they laughed when she insulted me, through the way they excused her tantrums, through the way they turned my pain into a joke and called it family humor. By the time we were adults, Claire wasn't just spoiled. She was practiced. She knew exactly how to perform innocence. She knew how to cry at the right time, how to sound concerned while delivering a knife. She knew how to walk into a room and instantly locate the person with the most power and attach herself to them like a vine. And when Grandpa's health began to decline, Claire recognized the shift immediately. Because Grandpa Henry wasn't just the oldest person in the family. He was the foundation. He was the one who had built the wealth everyone quietly depended on. He was the one who paid for emergencies. The one who bailed my parents out when they made bad decisions. The one who had the house everyone assumed would eventually become theirs. He was the one Claire couldn't control. And that made him her target. I noticed it slowly at first. A visit here. A phone call there. Claire suddenly checking in on Grandpa more than she ever had before. She started showing up with little gifts, homemade cookies, a scarf she claimed she saw and thought of him, a book she insisted he would love. If you didn't know Claire, you might have thought it was sweet. But I knew my sister. Claire didn't do sweet. She did strategic. I remember one evening when I arrived at Grandpa's house and saw Claire's car already parked outside. My chest tightened, the way it always did when I realized she'd been somewhere before me, somewhere she could plant seeds before I even walked in. When I stepped inside, Claire was sitting beside Grandpa's chair, laughing too brightly at something he'd said. She turned to me with that polished smile that never reached her eyes. "There she is," she said, like she was welcoming a guest to her home. "We were just talking about you." My stomach dropped. Grandpa looked up and smiled warmly. "Your sister was telling me you've been working too hard," he said. Claire's voice softened immediately. "I just worry about her, Grandpa. She's always so busy. She never rests." The words sounded caring, but the message underneath was clear. Danielle isn't here. Danielle doesn't show up. Danielle doesn't care. It was the same trick every time Claire would wrap her accusation in concern, so anyone who challenged her would look cruel. And my parents fell for it, like they always had. What Claire didn't understand was that Grandpa Henry wasn't my parents. He didn't respond to performance the way they did. He responded to patterns. He had lived too long to be impressed by charm. He'd spent his life watching people smile while reaching for something behind their backs. He'd built a business from nothing. He'd survived family betrayal. He'd watched greed ruin relationships. He could read people the way some people read weather, and Claire's storm clouds were obvious. There was something else Claire didn't know either, something so simple, so quiet, and so devastating it still makes me shiver when I think about it. Grandpa had installed a security camera in his living room. It wasn't because he was paranoid. It wasn't because he didn't trust his family. It was because his hearing had started fading. He hated missing details. He hated nodding along when he wasn't sure what was said. So he installed a small camera with a sensitive microphone, something he could replay later if he needed to. It was mounted in the corner of a bookshelf, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. I had never noticed it, and Claire never noticed it either. Because Claire never truly looked at Grandpa's house. She looked through it, like a person walking through a museum, already deciding what they want to take home. Over the next few weeks, Claire's visits increased. Sometimes she'd come on days no one else did. She'd stay for hours. She'd sit with Grandpa and ask him questions that sounded harmless but weren't. "So, Grandpa," she'd say casually, stirring her tea, "have you thought about what you want to do with the house? It's such a big responsibility." Or, "I just want to make sure your money is protected. You know how people can take advantage of older people." The irony of her saying that still makes me want to laugh and scream at the same time. And then, slowly, she started doing what she did best. She started rewriting me, not with one big lie, with dozens of small ones. "She never calls you, does she?" Claire would ask, sounding sad. "She's always been so independent," she'd sigh. "Sometimes I think she doesn't need family anymore. I just hope she's not using you, Grandpa. You're so generous." That one hurt the most, because the truth was the opposite. I was the one quietly supporting everyone. I was the one sending money through Grandpa so my parents could fix their roof, so Claire could avoid bankruptcy, so my mother could afford medication. I was the one keeping the family afloat. And Claire was planting the idea that I was the leech, that I was the selfish one. I didn't know she was saying those things. I didn't know she was poisoning him against me. I only felt something shifting. I felt the air change whenever I walked into a room. I felt Claire watching me with sharper focus, like she was checking her progress. And I felt my parents becoming more confident in their contempt. Because Claire wasn't just working on Grandpa. She was working on the narrative. She wanted a story that would justify what she planned to do next. Because if she could convince Grandpa I was dramatic, dishonest, attention-seeking, then when she finally made her move, no one would question it. No one would defend me. No one would believe me. And that was always Claire's goal, not just to hurt me, but to make sure I had no credibility when I tried to stand up. That's why, when I injured my knee, she didn't see it as an accident. She saw it as a gift, a perfect prop, a perfect opportunity to create a scene where I looked ridiculous and she looked righteous. And the worst part, it worked on my parents immediately. From the second I walked into that Sunday dinner with a crutch, my mother's face tightened like she was already annoyed. My father's expression said, "Here we go again." Claire's eyes lit up with excitement. She spent the meal poking at me, smiling sweetly while calling me a liar. "Still playing the victim, Danielle? You always did love attention. Don't you think you're being a little dramatic?" And every time she said it, she glanced at Grandpa, watching, measuring, waiting for him to react. She wanted to see if her seeds had taken root. She wanted to see if Grandpa would look at me the way my parents did, like I was a problem. But Grandpa didn't laugh. He didn't smirk. He didn't roll his eyes. He watched, quietly, carefully. And that scared Claire more than she realized. Because manipulators thrive on predictable reactions. They thrive on people who respond exactly the way they expect, people like my parents, who were so desperate to keep the family story intact that they'd rather laugh at my pain than admit they were wrong. Grandpa wasn't predictable. He was observant. That night, while everyone was distracted, Grandpa pulled me aside. His hand was warm on my arm, his eyes sharp despite his age. "You're like me when I was young," he said softly. I blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" He didn't explain. He just looked at me for a long moment, like he was seeing a younger version of himself standing in front of him, someone overlooked, underestimated, blamed for things they didn't do. Then he said something I didn't understand until later. "But you won't have to wait until the end of your life to be seen." At the time, I thought he was comforting me. I didn't realize he was making a promise, because while Claire was busy performing, Grandpa was already gathering proof. While Claire was busy poisoning my name, Grandpa was already building a case. And while Claire was planning her grand finale, humiliating me in front of him, destroying my credibility, Grandpa was quietly preparing the moment that would expose her forever. Claire thought she was walking toward victory, but she was walking into a trap she built with her own arrogance. And the camera in Grandpa's living room was waiting. I didn't know any of that the night I drove home crying. All I knew was that my knee felt like it had been shattered from the inside, and my chest felt worse. I sat in my car with the engine off, forehead pressed against the steering wheel, trying to breathe through the humiliation. The kind of humiliation that doesn't just make you sad, it makes you question your own reality. Because when the people who raised you laugh while you're on the floor, a part of you starts wondering if you really are the problem. I finally drove home with my vision still blurred, my hands shaking around the wheel. I iced my knee. I took the pain medication the doctor had prescribed. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling until the sky outside my window turned from black to gray. And even then, the scene wouldn't leave my head. Claire holding my crutch like a trophy. My mother's voice, she always exaggerates. My father's smirk. And my cousin Emma crying in the corner, ignored like I had been ignored my whole life. By morning, the swelling in my knee was worse. But I didn't call my family. I didn't text anyone. I didn't ask for an apology because I'd learned something long ago. In my family, apologies weren't offered. They were demanded from me. If I brought up what happened, Claire would claim it was a joke. My parents would say I was too sensitive. And somehow I'd end up apologizing for making a scene on Grandpa's floor. So I stayed quiet. Again. But this time, my silence didn't feel like peace. It felt like surrender. What I didn't know was that while I lay in bed replaying the humiliation, Claire was still at Grandpa's house. She had stayed behind after I left, glowing with confidence. In her mind, the night had gone perfectly. She had done exactly what she came to do. She had made me look weak, dramatic, and dishonest in front of the one person she couldn't fully control. She believed she had finally cracked Grandpa's loyalty. She believed she had won. And when someone like Claire believes they've won, they get careless. That's the thing about manipulators. They're careful while they're hunting. But the moment they think the prey is trapped, they celebrate too loudly. Claire didn't go to another room. She didn't lower her voice. She didn't even bother to hide the satisfaction in her face. She stayed right there in the living room, Grandpa's living room, where the camera sat quietly in the corner of the bookshelf, recording everything. She pulled out her phone like a teenager showing off after a prank. She called her best friend, pacing near the window, still riding the high of what she'd done. I wasn't there to hear it, but I would later. In perfect clarity. "Hey," Claire said, laughing. "It's done." I finally exposed her in front of everyone, including Grandpa. She fell on the floor like an idiot. She paused, listening to her friend's reaction, then laughed again louder. "The inheritance is basically mine now," she added, like Grandpa was already dead. Like his life was a prize she'd earned. That sentence alone should have been enough to damn her forever. But Claire didn't stop there. She kept talking. She kept bragging. She kept revealing every ugly intention she'd been hiding behind those fake cookies and soft smiles for months. "She's been faking for attention for years," she said. "I swear Danielle's whole personality is just victim." But Grandpa saw it tonight. He finally saw it. Now he'll know who the real daughter is. The real daughter. As if I wasn't even family. As if I was an inconvenience that had to be erased. She laughed again, hung up, and then, like nothing happened, she walked back into the kitchen where my parents were, beaming with confidence, and they smiled back. Because Claire had always been their favorite story. She never noticed Grandpa. Because Grandpa wasn't in the room anymore. He was standing behind the kitchen door, silent, watching. He had seen Claire yank my crutch. He had watched me hit the floor. He had heard my parents laugh. And now, he had heard Claire brag about the inheritance, like she'd already stolen it. The footage later showed him stepping into the hallway, one hand braced against the wall. His shoulders looked smaller in that moment, not because he was weak, but because he was grieving. Grieving for the family he thought he had. Grieving for the granddaughter he hoped might be different. Grieving for me, that night, after everyone finally left. Grandpa Henry sat alone in his study and reviewed the footage. He watched the scene once, then again, not because he doubted what he saw, but because he couldn't believe it. He had lived 82 years. He had survived poverty, built a life, buried friends, watched the world change. But there are some pains that never get easier, no matter how old you are. One of them is realizing your own family is capable of cruelty. His hand shook as he rewound the part where Claire laughed on the phone. Then he reached for his own phone, and he called his lawyer. I need to update my will immediately, he said, voice low but firm. And I need you to see something. The next morning, Grandpa called me. When I saw his name on my phone, my first instinct was dread. I thought maybe Claire had succeeded. I thought maybe Grandpa was calling to scold me for being dramatic, the way my parents always did. But his voice was different, urgent, clear. Danielle, he said, I need you to come over. Alone. Something in my chest tightened. Is everything okay? He hesitated, then said quietly, I've seen enough. I need you to trust me. Justice will come. Justice. No one in my family had ever used that word for me before. I drove to his house with my knee aching and my heart pounding. When I arrived, Grandpa was waiting in his study. The door was closed, the curtains drawn, the room filled with that familiar smell of old books and tea. He looked tired, but his eyes were sharp. He motioned for me to sit. And then he did something that still makes me emotional when I think about it. He reached across the desk and took my hand. Not like a grandfather comforting a child, like a witness taking an oath. I'm sorry, he said. I blinked. For what? For not stopping it sooner, he replied. For not protecting you the way I should have. My throat tightened. I didn't even know how to respond. I had spent so long convincing myself I didn't need protection that the idea of someone offering it felt unreal. Grandpa didn't tell me about the camera. He didn't tell me about Claire's phone call. And later, I understood why. He knew me. He knew my instincts. If I knew Claire had been recorded, I would confront her. I would demand answers. I would give her a chance to twist the story again, to cry, to claim she was misunderstood, to paint herself as the victim. Grandpa needed her to stay careless. He needed her to believe she was safe. So instead of telling me what he had, he asked me for something else. Tell me everything, he said gently. Every incident, every cruel word. Every time Claire humiliated me and my parents laughed. Every time I was blamed for something I didn't do. Every time I tried to help and was still called selfish. At first, I didn't know where to start. The memories were too many, piled on top of each other like heavy boxes in a closet I'd avoided opening. But Grandpa waited. He didn't interrupt. He didn't dismiss. He didn't laugh. He listened. And as I spoke, something inside me began to shift. Because for the first time in 35 years, someone wasn't asking me to be quiet. Someone wasn't telling me I was too sensitive. Someone wasn't rewriting my pain into a joke. Grandpa took out his phone and recorded my testimony. Not in a dramatic way, not like a courtroom scene. Just quietly, carefully. He asked gentle questions, guiding me through details. Dates when I could remember them. Locations, exact words. By the time I finished, my voice was hoarse. My hands were trembling. Tears had dried on my cheeks. Grandpa nodded slowly. I believe you, he said. Those 3 words hit me harder than the fall. I believe you. I didn't realize how badly I needed to hear that until someone finally said it. When I left his house that day, I sat in my car for a long time before driving away. My knee still hurt. My family still hated me. Claire was still out there, smiling and scheming. But something had changed. For the first time, I wasn't alone. That night, I started a journal. Not because I was planning revenge, because I was terrified my family would keep rewriting the truth until even I forgot it. I wrote down everything I could remember, incidents going back years, dates, places, words. On the first page, I wrote one sentence in thick black ink. If I don't record the truth, they'll rewrite it like they always do. I didn't know Grandpa was building the same case with video evidence. I didn't know his lawyer had already seen the footage. I didn't know new documents were already being drafted. All I knew was that for the first time in my life, someone had seen what my family really was, and he wasn't going to let them get away with it. 2 weeks later, Grandpa died. Suddenly, without warning. And I thought justice had died with him. I didn't know that his final gift was already waiting to explode in the lawyer's office. And when it did, Claire wouldn't just lose money. She would lose the story she'd spent her whole life using as a weapon. Because Grandpa didn't just leave an inheritance. He left the truth. 2 weeks after Grandpa called me into his study and said the word justice, my phone rang in the middle of a client meeting. I remember the exact moment because I almost didn't answer. I was in my office, sitting across from a couple who were trying to decide whether they could afford to send their daughter to college without ruining their retirement. I had spreadsheets open, notes on my desk, my professional voice ready. Then my phone buzzed. Grandpa's neighbor. For a split second, I felt irritation, then fear, sharp and immediate, because people don't call you from your grandfather's neighborhood during business hours unless something is wrong. I excused myself, stepped into the hallway, and answered. "Danielle," the voice said, shaky. "It's Henry." He collapsed. "The ambulance is here." The world tilted. I don't remember grabbing my coat. I don't remember taking the elevator. I don't remember driving. I only remember the sensation of moving through the city like I was underwater, every sound muffled, every traffic light too slow. By the time I arrived, it was already over. Grandpa Henry was gone. Sudden heart attack. No warning. No goodbye. No final conversation where I could tell him what he meant to me. No chance to ask what he had been planning. No chance to hear him say, "I believe you," one more time. I stood in his driveway with my crutch still under my arm, staring at the house like it had betrayed me too. The same house where my sister had grabbed my crutch. The same living room where my parents laughed. The same study where Grandpa held my hand like an oath and promised me justice. And now he was gone. The one person who had truly seen me in that family had left this world, and I had never felt more alone. The funeral was 3 days later. I wore the same simple black dress I wore to most formal events, the one that didn't draw attention. I didn't want attention. I wanted to disappear into grief without anyone judging how I mourned. But grief in my family wasn't treated like something sacred. It was treated like another stage. When I walked into the church, my parents barely glanced at me. My mother's eyes were already red, but not in the way mine were. Her tears looked practiced, like she'd rehearsed them in the mirror. My father stood stiffly, jaw clenched, staring ahead like he was trying to hold on to control. Claire arrived late. Of course she did. She walked in wearing an expensive black dress that hugged her figure perfectly, hair done, makeup flawless. She looked like she was attending a high-profile event, not saying goodbye to the man who had loved us. When she saw me, she didn't look away. She smiled, not a warm smile, a small, private smile that said, "You're alone now." And in that moment, I felt something cold settle inside me. Because she was right. Grandpa was the only shield I had ever had. During the service, I stood by his coffin for a long time after everyone else had stepped away. I stared at his face, peaceful and still, and tried to reconcile the fact that the man who had been so alive in his mind could now be reduced to silence. I remembered the way he used to tap his fingers on the arm of his chair when he was thinking, the way he always carried peppermints in his pocket, the way his voice softened when he said my name, like he was reminding me I mattered. You won't have to wait until the end of your life to be seen. I still didn't understand what he meant. I just knew he was gone. Behind me, I heard Claire whispering to my mother. Their voices were low, but grief makes you hyper-aware of everything. "Finally," Claire murmured, almost like a sigh of relief. "Now, we can move forward." Then, even quieter. "How much do you think he left?" My stomach turned. I wanted to spin around and scream. I wanted to ask how she could stand in front of a coffin and talk about money like it was the weather. But I didn't, because I knew exactly what would happen. My parents would tell me I was causing drama at a funeral. Claire would cry and claim I was attacking her while she was grieving. And I would become the villain again. So I swallowed it. Again, after the burial, the family gathered at my parents' house. Not to comfort each other. Not to share stories about Grandpa. To discuss the estate. The moment we walked in, the conversation shifted. People sat around the living room like they were waiting for a business meeting to start. Someone poured coffee. Someone brought out pastries. It was surreal, like Grandpa's death had unlocked a new level of entitlement. They talked about his house, his savings, his investments, his assets. They used the language of ownership, as if he had already handed everything to them personally. as if his life was a bank account they'd finally been granted access to. Claire sat in the center of the room, legs crossed, smiling like she was already spending money. She laughed at my father's jokes. She squeezed my mother's hand dramatically. She played the devoted granddaughter one last time because she believed the performance had paid off. And my parents fed into it. My father said, "Well, Henry always wanted to keep things in the family." My mother nodded, voice trembling. He loved Claire so much. She was always here for him. I sat on the edge of the room, silent, my crutch leaning against the chair beside me. My knee still ached, but the pain felt distant compared to what was happening in my chest. They weren't just forgetting me. They were rewriting me. Again. They spoke about Grandpa like he was a prize. They spoke about Claire like she was the rightful heir. And they spoke about me like I wasn't even there. At one point, my aunt glanced in my direction and said, almost politely, "Danielle's doing fine. She doesn't need anything." And my mother responded without missing a beat. "She always lands on her feet. She's lucky like that." Lucky. As if my entire life hadn't been built through sacrifice. As if I hadn't worked 2 jobs through college. As if I hadn't been the one quietly keeping their roof from collapsing and their debts from swallowing them. I looked at Claire. She was smiling, eyes bright, absorbing the praise like sunlight. And for the first time in my life, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel before. Not sadness, not even anger. Clarity. I saw my family exactly as they were, without excuses. My parents weren't confused. They weren't misguided. They were comfortable. Comfortable using me. Comfortable letting Claire hurt me. Comfortable believing the version of the story that required the least guilt. And Claire wasn't just mean. She was a predator. She hunted validation the way some people hunt money. She needed to win. She needed me to lose. Because if I ever stood tall, her reflection would shrink. That night, after everyone left, I went home and sat in my apartment with the lights off. I didn't cry at first. I just stared at the wall. I thought about Grandpa's study, the way he held my hand, the way he said he believed me, the way he said justice would come. And I felt a wave of grief so heavy it nearly knocked the air out of my lungs. Because he was gone. And the truth was, I didn't know what he had done. I didn't know about the lawyer. I didn't know about the documents. I didn't know about the video. All I knew was that the one person who had promised to protect me was dead, and I was about to walk into a will reading surrounded by people who had laughed at me on the floor. The will reading was scheduled for the following week. Claire was excited. She tried to hide it, but she couldn't. She started acting like someone who had already received the inheritance. She posted pictures on social media, wearing designer clothes, smiling too brightly, as if she wanted the world to see her thriving. Later, I would learn why. Claire was drowning in debt, over $80,000, credit cards, personal loans, a lifestyle she couldn't afford but refused to give up. She wasn't just greedy, she was desperate, and she believed Grandpa's money was her rescue rope. My parents were just as confident. My father talked about fixing things around the house and finally taking a vacation. My mother started mentioning renovations, like Grandpa's death had already been converted into new countertops. No one asked me how I was holding up. No one checked on my knee. No one mentioned the way Claire had grabbed my crutch. It was as if the incident had never happened. Because in my family, anything that made Claire look bad was erased. The morning of the will reading, I woke up early. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at my hands. I felt like I was walking into a courtroom where I'd already been sentenced. I didn't want money. I didn't want a house. I wanted Grandpa back. I wanted one more conversation. I wanted to hear his voice and know I wasn't crazy. But the only thing waiting for me was a cold lawyer's office and the faces of the people who had broken me. When I arrived, the office was exactly what you'd expect: sterile, polished, leather chairs arranged in a semicircle like we were about to watch a performance. And in a way, we were. I arrived early because I couldn't sit at home anymore. Grief made my apartment feel too quiet, too empty. I sat down and folded my hands in my lap, trying to steady my breathing. A few minutes later, the door opened. Claire walked in 15 minutes late, heels clicking against the marble floor, dressed like she was attending a gala. She looked around the room like she owned it. Then she smiled at me. That same small, private smile. The one that said, "You're alone now." My parents followed behind her, equally polished, equally confident. They sat beside Claire like loyal supporters at a trial. The lawyer stepped into the room and cleared his throat. He was an older man with gray hair and kind eyes, but even he looked uncomfortable, like he already knew what was coming. He opened a folder on his desk. "Before we proceed with the formal reading," he said, "Mr. Henry left specific instructions." Claire leaned forward slightly. Her smile grew. She was ready for her coronation. And then the lawyer said, the sentence that changed everything. He requested that I read his exact words before anything else. The room went quiet, and the first line of the will, Grandpa's first line, was about to crush them all. The lawyer didn't rush. He didn't dramatize it. He just opened Grandpa's folder, adjusted his glasses, and looked at all of us the way a doctor looks at a family before delivering a diagnosis. "Before we proceed with the formal reading," he said, "Mr. Henry left specific instructions. He requested that I read his exact words before anything else." Claire leaned forward in her chair like she was about to hear her name engraved in gold. My parents sat straighter too, their confidence filling the room like perfume, thick, expensive, and completely out of place. I stayed quiet. I didn't expect anything. Not money, not justice, not a miracle. Grandpa had loved me, but he was also fair. I assumed he'd split everything evenly. That was who he was. The lawyer unfolded a page and began. "Those who laugh at another's pain are not worthy of receiving anything from me," he read, voice calm. "And those who scheme in shadows will find themselves exposed in light." The words didn't just land in the room. They hung there. For a moment, no one moved. It was as if the air itself had thickened. Claire's smile froze halfway across her face, then slowly collapsed. My mother blinked rapidly, like she'd misheard. My father's jaw tightened, the smirk he'd worn for days suddenly gone. I felt my heart begin to race, not with excitement, but with something I couldn't name yet. A strange, uneasy feeling like the ground beneath us was shifting, and only Claire hadn't realized she was standing on a trapdoor. The lawyer paused, letting the silence settle. Then he continued. "Mr. Henry also left video evidence to accompany his will," he said. "He requested it be played in full before the terms are read." Claire's head snapped up. "Video evidence?" she repeated, too quickly, too sharp. My parents turned to each other, confused. I felt cold spread through my arms. A screen mounted on the wall, something I'd assumed was for presentations, flickered to life. The lawyer clicked a remote, and suddenly, Grandpa's living room filled the wall. The footage was so clear it made my stomach twist. The angle was slightly high, like it was coming from a corner. The timestamp appeared in the corner of the screen. It was the date of that Sunday dinner. I watched myself on camera, sitting on the couch, my knees stiff, my posture careful. I looked smaller than I remembered, tired, like I'd been trying to take up as little space as possible. Then I saw Claire. She moved through the room with that confident ease she always had, laughing, performing, touching my mother's shoulder like she was the sweetest daughter alive. If you didn't know her, you might have thought she was charming. But I knew what she was. I watched myself stand up, reaching for my crutch. I watched Claire step behind me. Then I watched her hand shoot out. I watched her yank the crutch away with deliberate force. I watched my body buckle. I watched myself fall. The sound came through the speakers, my cry of pain, sharp and raw. It echoed in the lawyer's office like a gunshot. My throat tightened so fast I could barely swallow. And then, the laughter. My mother's voice was unmistakable. "She always exaggerates," she said, and on the recording, she sounded amused, almost pleased. My father stood by the fireplace, arms crossed, watching me like I was a nuisance. Claire stood over me, holding my crutch like a trophy, her lips curled into that familiar sneer. In the lawyer's office, no one laughed. No one breathed. The only sound was the video, the echo of my humiliation playing back in perfect clarity. I stared at the screen, unable to look away, feeling my skin go hot and cold at the same time. It was one thing to remember it, It was another to watch it happen from the outside, to see how cruel it looked, how obvious it was, how unhuman they all appeared. Claire's chair creaked beside me. I glanced at her. Her face had gone pale. Her eyes were fixed on the screen like she was watching her own execution. Her hands trembled as she gripped her purse in her lap. But the video didn't stop. The next clip played seamlessly. It showed me limping toward the door, my shoulders hunched, my face turned away so no one could see me cry. It showed Claire following, just far enough behind to stay out of view of most people. Then it captured her leaning toward my mother in the hallway. "See," Claire whispered, smug. "I told you she was faking. Now Grandpa saw it too. He'll know who really deserves to be in this family." Hearing it in that office was different than remembering it. The words sounded sharper, colder, more calculated. There was no joking tone, no sisterly teasing. It was a strategy, a confession. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. My father's face drained of color. Claire's lips parted, but nothing came out. And then came the part that destroyed her completely. The screen shifted again. Claire was back in the living room after I'd left. She was alone near the window, phone pressed to her ear, pacing like she owned the world. She didn't whisper. She didn't hide. She spoke with loud, gleeful certainty. "Hey, it's done," she said, laughing. I finally exposed her in front of everyone, including Grandpa. She fell on the floor like an idiot. "The inheritance is basically mine now." Her laugh filled the speakers. It wasn't cute. It wasn't charming. It was ugly. It was the sound of someone celebrating cruelty. In the lawyer's office, I heard my mother make a strangled sob. My father stared at the floor like he couldn't look at the screen anymore. Claire looked like she might vomit. Her entire life had been built on the idea that she could say anything, do anything, and still be seen as the victim. And now her own voice was betraying her. Then the screen went black for half a second, and Grandpa's face appeared. It wasn't a casual recording. It was deliberate. He was sitting in his chair, centered in the frame, looking directly into the camera like he was staring straight into our souls. The lawyer's office felt suddenly smaller, like Grandpa's presence had entered the room. "Claire," Grandpa said calmly, "I watched you visit me these past months. You never once asked how I was feeling, only about my will, my plans, my assets." Claire's body jerked as if she'd been slapped. My heart pounded. Grandpa continued, voice steady but heavy. "You told me lies about Danielle," he said, "that she only calls when she needs something, that she doesn't care about family. I knew they were lies, because I was the one Danielle sent money through to help all of you." My breath caught. Even now, hearing him say it out loud made my eyes burn. My parents stared at the screen, frozen. Grandpa didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "I wanted to see how far you would go," he said. "And that night with the crutch, I saw everything. I heard everything. You didn't attack your sister out of anger. You planned it. You wanted to make her look like a liar in front of me." Claire's face twisted, and for the first time in my life, I saw real fear in her. Not fear of consequences, fear of being seen, because manipulators can survive anything except exposure. Grandpa leaned slightly forward, eyes sharp. "You thought you were clever," he said, "but I've been watching manipulators my whole life. I was surrounded by them when I was young. I know exactly what you are." His voice dropped, calm as a final verdict. "And I will not reward it." The screen went dark. Silence crashed over the room. For a moment, I couldn't move. My body felt locked in place, as if my nervous system didn't know how to respond. My eyes burned, but I refused to cry, not because I was trying to be strong, but because the shock had drained me. Then the lawyer cleared his throat. He reached for another document, and in that moment, I realized something that made my stomach flip. This wasn't just Grandpa leaving me money. This was Grandpa leaving me the truth. And the next words out of the lawyer's mouth were going to decide everything. For a few seconds after the screen went dark, nobody spoke. It was the kind of silence that doesn't feel empty, it feels heavy, like the room is holding its breath. Even the air conditioner seemed quieter. The lawyer's office, which had felt sterile and cold when we walked in, now felt like a courtroom after a guilty verdict. Claire sat perfectly still. My mother's hands trembled in her lap. My father stared at the carpet like he was trying to disappear into it, and I couldn't move at all. My body was frozen somewhere between humiliation and relief, between grief and disbelief. Because I had just watched my worst moment replayed on a screen, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't the only one who had to carry it. Everyone had seen it, everyone had heard it, and no one could rewrite it. The lawyer cleared his throat. He didn't look smug. He didn't look satisfied. If anything, he looked sad, like he'd spent years dealing with families, tearing each other apart. And he hated that this was how Grandpa Henry's story ended. He picked up another document and said, Mr. Henry included an exclusion clause in his will. The word exclusion landed like a stone. Claire's head snapped up. Her eyes were wide, but still defiant. I could almost see her mind scrambling for angles, excuses, loopholes. Claire didn't know how to lose. Even when the truth was playing on a screen, she believed she could talk her way out of it. The lawyer began reading. Any individual who participated in the deliberate scheme to harm Danielle Foster's reputation or physical well-being, as documented in the attached video evidence, is permanently and irrevocably excluded from all inheritance. My mother let out a sound, half gasp, half sob. My father's face went gray. Claire's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The lawyer continued, voice steady. This includes any individual who laughed at, encouraged, or failed to intervene during the documented assault. And that was the moment my parents realized the trap wasn't only for Claire, it was for them too. My mother's eyes filled with tears so fast they spilled down her cheeks. My father's hands clenched into fists on his knees. He looked like a man who had just been forced to watch himself become someone he didn't recognize. But Claire didn't break. Not yet. She shot to her feet so abruptly her chair scraped against the floor. This is entrapment, she screamed, voice sharp and high. He set me up. He recorded me without my consent. That's illegal. Her face was flushed now, the mask cracking. She looked around the room like she expected someone to back her up, like she expected my parents to rush to her defense the way they always had. For a heartbeat, I thought they might. Old habits are hard to kill. But my parents didn't move, because the evidence had done something Claire's manipulation never allowed before. It had forced them to see reality. The lawyer didn't flinch. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply said, Mr. Henry anticipated that response. Then he lifted another page and read Grandpa's words, calmly, like a final nail being placed into a coffin. If Claire claims entrapment, remind her I didn't force her to grab her sister's crutch. I didn't force her to lie about Danielle to my face for months. I didn't force her to brag on the phone about securing an inheritance before I was even dead. I simply documented her revealing who she truly is. That is not entrapment. That is evidence. Claire's face drained of color. For the first time, she didn't have a counterattack. She didn't have tears. She didn't have charm. She had nothing. She collapsed back into her chair like her bones had turned to water. The lawyer added, almost gently, for the record, Mr. Henry had every legal right to record inside his own home. Claire's eyes flickered wildly, as if she was still searching for a crack in the wall she could squeeze through. But Grandpa had sealed every exit. Then the lawyer said something I wasn't prepared for. Additionally, he continued, Mr. Henry included corroborating evidence of a pattern of mistreatment. He requested that Danielle's personal journal be referenced. My stomach dropped. My journal. My throat tightened so fast it hurt. I hadn't even told anyone about that journal except Grandpa. I hadn't shown it to anyone. It wasn't meant for court. It wasn't meant for revenge. It was meant for survival. It was my proof to myself that I wasn't crazy, that I wasn't imagining years of cruelty, that I wasn't the problem. The lawyer went on. Mr. Henry discovered the journal, reviewed it with Danielle's permission, and verified key incidents. My hands started shaking. I folded them tighter in my lap, trying to stop. Grandpa had done that. Even after he died, he was still protecting me. He wasn't just leaving me money. He was leaving me validation. Then the lawyer turned to the final page, and his tone shifted slightly, not to drama, but to gravity. There is one more truth Mr. Henry wished to reveal. Claire's head lifted again, slowly, like she was watching the final blow approach and couldn't stop it. The lawyer read, "For 10 years, Danielle Foster has quietly sent money to support this family through Henry Foster, over $50,000 total." My mother made a choking sound. My father's eyes widened. Claire's lips parted again, but this time it was disbelief, not anger. The lawyer continued listing it, calmly, like he was reading a ledger. Home repairs when the roof leaked. Claire's credit card payments when she nearly filed for bankruptcy. My mother's medication and medical bills. Emergency expenses when my parents were short on rent. Money that my family had always assumed came from Grandpa. The lawyer paused and then read Grandpa's words, exactly as he had written them. "The daughter you called selfish and attention-seeking has been quietly saving this family for a decade while asking for nothing in return. The daughter you championed has been scheming to steal from the very person who kept her afloat. Now you know the truth about both of them." My father sat frozen. Not angry, not defensive, just broken. My mother sobbed into her hands, shoulders shaking, like she'd finally realized what she had done. Or maybe she was sobbing because she'd been caught. I didn't know. I only knew that for the first time in my life, my pain had been spoken out loud in a room where it couldn't be mocked. And yet, the strangest thing was happening inside me. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel satisfied. I felt grief. Grief so sharp it made my chest ache. Because all I could think was, I wish Grandpa was here. I wish he could see their faces. I wish he could hear the silence. I wish he could feel what it meant to finally be believed. Tears rolled down my cheeks, and I didn't wipe them away. Not because I wanted anyone to see me cry, but because I couldn't stop. Claire stared at the table, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles were white. Something was breaking behind her eyes, not just her plans, but her entire self-image. The golden child, the chosen one, the one who deserved everything. She had built her life on being adored, and now she was being exposed as a thief, a liar, a bully, a person who could hurt her own sister and laugh. The lawyer closed the folder slowly. "The remainder of the will outlines the distribution of assets," he said, "but the primary instruction has already been fulfilled." He looked around the room, and for the first time, his gaze landed on me. Mr. Henry wanted the truth to be heard. My parents couldn't look at me. Claire couldn't look at me. And I realized something in that moment that felt almost surreal. For years, they had been waiting for me to explode, to scream, to accuse, to beg for fairness. They had spent their lives painting me as dramatic and unstable, so they expected me to become exactly what they said I was the moment I had power. They expected revenge. They expected cruelty. They expected me to finally become the monster they'd always pretended I was. And the fact that I sat there quietly, tears on my face, breathing slowly, saying nothing, terrified Claire more than anything, because she suddenly understood something that had never occurred to her. I didn't need to destroy her. She had already destroyed herself. The truth had done it. And what happened next, what I chose to do after walking out of that lawyer's office, would prove that I was nothing like them. That was the part Claire feared most of all. Because if I stayed kind, if I stayed calm, if I stayed human, then she couldn't even comfort herself with the lie that we were the same. And as I stood up to leave, I felt Grandpa's presence like a hand on my shoulder. Not a ghost, not magic. Just the weight of his love and his final lesson. Justice doesn't always come with violence. Sometimes it comes with evidence. And now the evidence was in the open. The world had finally seen who Claire really was. And there was no performance left that could save her. When I walked out of that lawyer's office, the sunlight outside felt wrong. Too bright. Too normal. Cars moved through the street. People held coffee cups. Strangers laughed on sidewalks like nothing had happened. Like my entire childhood hadn't just been played on a screen and exposed in front of the people who had built their lives on denying it. I stood there for a moment with my hands shaking, not sure where to put all the feelings inside me. My knee still ached, but the pain felt distant compared to the heaviness in my chest. I had spent my whole life imagining what it would feel like to finally be proven right. I thought it would feel like victory. It didn't. It felt like grief with the lights turned on. Because even though the truth had won, Grandpa was still gone, and the only reason the truth had been spoken at all was because he had died. For the next 2 days, I barely spoke to anyone. I went through the motions of work, canceled a few meetings, and sat alone in my apartment at night, staring at Grandpa's framed photo on my desk. His smile looked gentle, almost amused, like he had known exactly how this would play out. My phone buzzed constantly. My mother called and hung up before leaving a voicemail. My father sent one stiff text, "We need to talk." Claire didn't contact me at all. That didn't surprise me. Claire only spoke when she had control, and after that office, she had none. The strangest thing was how quickly the world outside our family began to shift. Grandpa's lawyer had warned me that readings were supposed to be private, but someone in that office, someone who had watched Claire scream about entrapment while the video played, had apparently decided the world deserved to see it. Within days, a short clip of Claire's meltdown was circulating through her social circle. I never found out who leaked it. Maybe it was a secretary who had seen too many entitled heirs. Maybe it was someone who had a sister like me. Maybe it was just the universe finally getting tired of Claire's performance. Whatever the reason, the effect was immediate. Claire's friends disappeared. The people who had always surrounded her, laughing too loudly, taking selfies with her, feeding off her confidence, vanished like smoke. Calls went unanswered. Texts were left unread. Invitations stopped coming. Her boyfriend left her with a single message. "I didn't sign up for this kind of drama. Good luck." That was it. No conversation. No apology. Just abandonment. And for the first time in her life, Claire experienced what it felt like to be disposable. The debt she'd been hiding for years didn't disappear just because her reputation collapsed. The credit card companies didn't care that her inheritance was gone. The lenders didn't care that her friends had vanished. They wanted their money. Claire was over $80,000 in debt, and without Grandpa's estate, she had no rescue rope. She sold her luxury car. She sold her designer bags. She sold jewelry I knew she'd bought with money she didn't have. She moved out of her expensive apartment and into a tiny studio in a neighborhood she used to mock whenever we drove through it. And the cruelest part? None of it was because I did anything. I didn't have to destroy her. The truth did. Meanwhile, my parents were unraveling in a different way. They weren't losing their social circle the way Claire was, but they were losing something they had relied on their whole lives: denial. They couldn't deny what they saw on that screen. They couldn't deny the sound of their own laughter. They couldn't deny the fact that the daughter they called selfish had been quietly saving them for 10 years. My mother started leaving long voicemails full of tears and half-sentences. My father tried to sound practical, like we were discussing logistics, but his voice cracked every time he said Grandpa's name. I didn't respond right away. Not because I wanted to punish them, because I needed space to breathe. I needed time to decide what kind of person I wanted to be now that I had power, because that was the part no one talks about. People imagine revenge like it's satisfying, like it's simple, but when you finally have the ability to hurt the people who hurt you, you realize something terrifying. You could become them, and I refused. 2 weeks after the will reading, I called a family meeting. Not at Grandpa's house, which was now legally mine, but at a neutral place, a quiet coffee shop with soft lighting and no history in the walls. I wanted to speak to them as adults, not as characters trapped in our family's old script. They arrived separately. My parents looked older than they had 2 weeks earlier. My father's shoulders were slumped. My mother's eyes were swollen from crying. Claire came last, sitting as far from me as possible, staring at the table like it might open up and swallow her. For a moment, none of us spoke. Then I took a slow breath and said, "I'm not here to humiliate anyone." Claire flinched as if she didn't believe me. My parents looked up, startled. I leaned forward slightly, keeping my voice calm, not soft, not angry, just steady. "I'm here because Grandpa gave me something," I said. "And it wasn't just a house, it was a choice. He gave me the chance to decide what happens next." My mother started crying immediately. My father whispered, "Danielle, we're sorry." I didn't respond to that word. Sorry had been used too cheaply in my family. Sorry could be performance. Sorry could be manipulation. Sorry could be a way to make me responsible for their emotions again. So I didn't take the bait. Instead, I laid out boundaries. Clear, firm, non-negotiable. I told my parents they had 6 months to find new housing. I would provide initial rent assistance so they wouldn't be homeless, because I refused to become cruel. But they could not live in a home I owned while pretending nothing had happened. They needed to build a life separate from the one they had built on my silence. My mother sobbed harder. My father stared at his hands like he couldn't understand how his world had flipped. Then I turned to Claire. She didn't look up. "I'm not giving you money," I said. Not a dollar, not a loan, not a second chance disguised as charity. Claire's throat moved as she swallowed. "You're 32, I continued. "You've never had to stand on your own because you've always had someone to manipulate. That ends now." She finally lifted her eyes. They were red, but there was no charm in them, no performance, just raw fear. For a second, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Then I remembered the floor, the crutch, the laughter, and the way she whispered, "Now Grandpa saw it too." I kept my voice even. "I'm not doing to you what you did to me," I said, "but I'm also done being your victim." Then I said the sentence that changed the air between us. "These are boundaries, not punishments. The difference is that boundaries protect me. Punishments would only poison me." My father's face crumpled. He put his head in his hands. My mother reached for me instinctively, then stopped, as if she didn't have the right. Claire sat frozen, like she'd never heard anyone speak to her without fear before. I stood up. "That's it," I said. "That's what Grandpa wanted. Truth and consequences." And I left, not slamming the door, not making a scene, just walking away with my spine straight. For the first time in my life, I felt light, not because I had won, because I had finally chosen myself. Claire's downfall continued without me. Her friends stayed gone. Her debt tightened like a noose. Hiring managers recognized her name. Some had seen the video, others had heard the story. People didn't want to employ someone who could hurt her own sister and brag about inheritance before a man was even buried. She couldn't charm her way out of that. She ended up taking a retail job, something she once would have mocked because it was the only place that would hire her without asking questions. And then, 3 weeks after the will reading, Grandpa's lawyer called me. "There's a private package Mr. Henry specified should be delivered separately," he said. I drove to his office that afternoon with my heart pounding, not knowing what to expect. I thought it might be paperwork, a deed, something practical. Instead, he handed me a small velvet box. Inside was my grandmother's wedding ring. Simple, elegant, a thin gold band with a modest diamond that caught the light softly. My hands shook as I held it. Everyone in my family had assumed that ring would go to Claire. She was the golden one, the one who deserved the heirlooms. But Grandpa had given it to me. There was also a letter, handwritten in Grandpa's careful script. I sat in my car in the parking lot and read it through tears. "My dear Danielle," it began. He wrote about my grandmother, how she had been underestimated and overlooked by her family her entire life. He wrote that she gave him the ring because he was the only one who truly saw her worth. "And now," he wrote, "I give it to you for the same reason." I pressed the letter to my chest, sobbing quietly in the car. Then I kept reading. Grandpa confessed something I hadn't expected. He admitted he had known about Claire's scheme for months. He knew she was poisoning my name during her visits. He didn't warn me because he needed her to feel safe enough to reveal her true nature completely. He needed undeniable proof, not just for lawyers, for my parents, so they could finally see with their own eyes who their daughters truly were. He apologized for that silence, and then he wrote the line that felt like his hand on my shoulder again. "Be strong, my girl, but don't let bitterness poison your beautiful heart. Your sister is already destroyed by her own choices. You don't need to add to it. The best revenge is becoming everything they said you couldn't be." I cried for a long time. Not from pain, from being truly seen. Even in death, Grandpa was still protecting me, still teaching me, still loving me. And I didn't realize it then, but that letter would become the reason I made the next decision of my life, the decision that would prove, once and for all, that I wasn't going to let my family's cruelty write my ending. Because the story didn't end with Claire losing everything. It ended with me building something new, something good, something that could never be taken away. Some stories don't hurt because of what strangers do to us. They hurt because the people who were supposed to protect us become the ones who laugh the loudest when we fall. Danielle's story isn't just about inheritance or a sister's cruelty. It's about something far deeper. The quiet damage that happens when a family chooses a golden child and turns another child into a scapegoat. But what makes this story unforgettable is the kind of justice it delivers. Not the loud, messy kind. Not revenge that turns the victim into a villain. Instead, it's truth documented, undeniable, and revealed at the exact moment no one can rewrite it anymore. And in the end, Danielle proves something powerful. Real strength isn't destroying the people who broke you. Real strength is setting boundaries, protecting your worth, and refusing to let bitterness steal your future. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, if you've ever been blamed for simply existing, I hope this story reminds you that you deserve to be seen, valued, and defended. Thank you for listening. And if this touched your heart, please subscribe to Hanjiwie Yagi for more emotional, twist-filled stories that heal as much as they shock.